Thanks, Acting Speaker, and I rise to contribute to the Superannuation Legislation Amendment Bill 2025, and my role on this, not the bill, but this superannuation scheme called ESSS. I know everyone was calling it S or something else, but it was called ESSS. I was an original member of the scheme back in 1987 when it became operational, and I'm still a member of the scheme. I've also, as my role as the Secretary of the Ambulance Union, I was a delegate to the board for many, many years. And I've got to say the principle of the scheme when it started was that emergency service workers, because it was a scheme only for emergency service workers, police, fire, ambulance, SES paid officials, was a scheme premised on 30 years of service, and you would max out your defined benefit. Every employee in the ambulance service, the fire service, the police service were entitled to the defined benefits in 1987. I do have to remind the member for Hawthorn who said that those on the opposite benches are supportive of emergency service workers. I remind him that Jeff Kennett in 1994 changed the legislation for new employees coming into the emergency services that they couldn't be in the defined benefits unless they were frontline workers. And this meant that people that were working as call takers and dispatchers in the communication centre, they didn't define them as frontline workers, yet they dealt with emergency situations every day. So those people that came into the industry after 1994 couldn't be in the defined benefits, which I think was damning of the government at the time. And clearly it was an introduction of that legislation or that provision to prevent the costings and the liability of government to carry those defined benefit, or should have been defined benefit members. And there were many, many people that are still working in the industry today that should have been in the defined benefits that are not in the defined benefits. The other thing I will say in regard to the representation of SFF members and not being able to get anyone to nominate to be a delegate to the board, I can tell you now my experiences when I was on the board, it was very difficult to get people to come forward to be representatives of their membership. And I should say that that is a fact that's been put forward, and what the unions would be trying to do is make sure that those SSF members are properly represented rather than they have no representation to the board. And that's what unions are about, and that is representing the collective for better outcomes. And in particular, superannuation, that is fundamental to people's terms and conditions. The other thing I want to clarify is the member for Shepparton raised issues about CFA volunteers. CFA volunteers are not part of the scheme. They're not paid employees, so they can't be in the scheme because they don't receive a wage from the CFA and they certainly don't pay super and don't collect superannuation benefits from the CFA. Of course, the amendments here to this bill aim to make superannuation fairer and more flexible and more supportive, obviously, for our emergency service superannuation scheme members and their families. And of course, as I said before, I was a delegate to the board for many, many years before I left the Ambulance Union in 2018. I know it says about ensuring the 90% superable salary policy that is applied consistently. I was part of the negotiations around the 90% superable salary policy because previously the executive members of the emergency services were only entitled to 75%. And as I said before, the start of this scheme was premised around 30 years of maximising the benefits of defined benefits. But I'll give you an example. You know, if you started in the industry at 21 or 22 and you worked 30 years, how are you going to retire at 51 and 52, even though the benefits were good? But as time rolled on, the benefits weren't as good. You couldn't continue to contribute, and the employer stopped contributing for you once you clocked up 30 years of service. But that has changed in more recent years because the employer now contributes towards the accumulation scheme, which is better for those people that have clocked up 30 years. And it'll be great to see the workforce now, the younger workforce now, hopefully stay in the emergency services for 30 years if they can cope with it if they're not injured by the job, and if they're well supported, such as being supported by a strong government supporting our emergency service workers, which we've shown over many, many years to do so. And this is a fantastic scheme, and it's a scheme that will continue to grow. And I know all of the workers within the emergency services love this scheme, absolutely love it. And I encourage all the new employees that come into the scheme to at least contribute their 7% towards their superannuation. They can do that under super sacrifice, which is a great benefit to them. And by contributing the 7%, really means that they maximise their benefits. And it's not just the long-term superannuation outcomes, it's also the other things. If they get injured in the job, there are provisions for things like temporary pension, permanent pensions, those sorts of things. There are death and disability benefits, which is really important. And I know we hate talking about those sorts of things, but unfortunately we've seen people in their younger age either die in the job or have an accident outside of the job, or unfortunately we've seen in emergency services some of our younger generation and even some of our older generation unfortunately take their own lives. And we've seen that some families have been not only in distress because of that trauma, but also in financial distress due to either the employee not contributing an amount that would have delivered the benefits to those families in supporting those families. And it's so important that they do that. I do want to acknowledge the major unions that are involved in ESSS, the Police Association, the United Fighter Fires Union, the Victorian Ambulance Union, and prior to the Victorian Ambulance Union, the Ambulance Employees Australia. And I've got to say, all those other unions that are involved with SSF, I commend all of their actions, and I've seen them work closely together in regard to being on the board and the decisions made by the ESSS board. And of course, I want to acknowledge the CEO of ESSS, Robbie Campo, who's a fantastic CEO and will do a great job as the CEO of ESSS. So that's really pleasant to see. It's great to see that one of the amendments gives members more control in regard to making frequent changes to their contribution rates. I did make reference to the 7%, which is important, but in the defined benefits you can range from 0% up to 9%, and it's pleasing to see that you can change your rate more than once a year now out of this bill. And that's, again, really important for each member. And that will depend on individual circumstances, where it might change during the course of the year, where people might think they prefer more take-home pay, but if their circumstances change, they might think at certain parts of the year they can increase the percentage of their contributions to superannuation. And again, as I say, and I know in the ambulance EBA, they can contribute their superannuation under super sacrifice. It may even be a national thing now, I don't know, but certainly under their EBA they can contribute under super sacrifice, which is great. Now, as I referred to before about the percentages and how important it is, how important the scheme is, and how supportive it is of the membership. And as I've said before, if one sustains in the job physical or mental injuries, and they may never be able to go back to that particular role that they had. And I'll use the example of a paramedic. I can't speak for the police, I can't speak for the firefighters, but a frontline paramedic may injure their back, may have a mental health injury, may never ever get back to even close to 100% of getting back to the job. They are very limited in areas where they can go to within the ambulance service in regard to return to work and having alternative duties. So the scheme is very supportive in that way in providing temporary pension, permanent pension, supporting of retraining, those sorts of things through the scheme. And as I say, that's why it's such a valuable scheme, because it does look after its members. That doesn't mean to say it's perfect. It's not perfect. Nothing is ever perfect, but they certainly try and look after their members as best they possibly can. As I said, I have a long history with this scheme. I joined the scheme when it started back in 1987. And the member for Wendourie's not here. In 1987, I was, what was I in 1987? 29, I think. So there you go. I do remember it, and it did start before what Keating and that introduced in 1992. Oh, is that the end of me? Sorry.